This is the Brave New Coin Crypto Conversation, hosted by Andy Pickering.
Hi everyone, Andy Pickering here. I'm your host and welcome to the Crypto Conversation, a Brave New Coin podcast where we talk to the people building the future in the Bitcoin, blockchain and cryptocurrency space. My guest today is Arif Khan, CEO and co-founder of Alethea AI. Alethea AI is the world's first decentralized synthetic content network that allows users to create AI-generated media. Welcome to the show, Arif.
Great to be here, Andy. Thanks for having me on.
This is quite interesting, Arif. So I think the vision of Alethea AI is to build the world's most trusted synthetic media network. So to start off with, I think you better explain what you mean by synthetic media.
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point to look at the evolving landscape in the media environment. About 5 to 7 years ago now, the problem of deepfakes was barely surfacing. Deepfakes are digital copies of yourself or someone else that you know. It's a fake, altered, or manipulated image that is obviously fake, but has elements of realism that prevent the viewer from distinguishing what is fake or real. Now, about 5, 6 years ago, it was starting to make some tremors in certain industries like the pornography industry or other industries in Hollywood that were experimenting with CGI tools like this. So you've seen more recent application of these tools in Hollywood where you can de-age someone or you can swap a face and resurrect a celebrity. This sort of CGI tools are really good in an artistic or entertainment context. But where we are today is that these CGI tools are becoming democratized. Just like think of the Bitcoin revolution and how people started to understand sound money, understand the blockchain, understand immutability. All of these things are beginning to occur in the synthetic media world, which is media that isn't real, but looks so real that it's deceptively real. So more and more people are able to do what normally you'd pay a Hollywood production studio to recreate. And sometimes the cost of that would be an astronomical amount a few years ago. But today with open source GitHub repositories and with a good AI engineer and code, you can essentially create really high quality deep fake face swaps where you swap a person onto another. The analogy that I normally give is think of the transition that we went from Photoshop to Instagram and what that did for the photo, for the app movements, for cameramen, for photographers, right? So you had to have a technical piece of software, I think about a decade ago, to edit a photo and to make it look good. But with the advent of Instagram, you can do that pretty effortlessly now, and you don't necessarily need the technical tools because the computing power to edit a photograph can happen at the edge, which is on your device. It still requires technical tools to create synthetic media, but it's getting cheaper, faster, and better at an astonishingly fast rate.
Yes, it is. I think we should dig into some of this stuff one point at a time. I really want to understand what a deepfake is, how a deepfake is created, and you did mention that, you know, technology is advancing so rapidly that it is becoming easier and cheaper, and, you know, eventually anyone will be able to do this themselves. So maybe just to rewind slightly, I understand that you've just been in Davos. Tell me about what you were doing there and what that experience was like.
It's a strange sort of surreal environment where you end up living in space and time, which is sort of distant from all of the surrounding world and its events. So Davos really brings together all of the elites. From my perspective, I was there to talk about the harms of synthetic media, but also elucidate and demonstrate the potential possibility of using synthetic media for good. We are at Alethea trying to create a trusted synthetic media network. As part of that, we're trying to show good use cases for synthetic media. And the use case that we came up with was how do we bring attention to the problem of climate change and how do we do it in a way that allows people to understand that synthetic media tools have been used for this, but they've also been used to guide us and move us in the right direction, as opposed to sort of creating deep fakes of actors or using them for malicious purposes, which is normally the common storyline that gets carried in the media. What we did was we created synthetic copies of public figures who were essentially apologizing for not acting on climate change. So we forecasted to the future. And so we had digital copies of President Trump, Boris Johnson, Scott Morrison, looking at the past and reflecting on their failures to act on climate change. The project is called Project Apologia, and we were able to create this narrative where we want world leaders to be able to hold a mirror up to themselves and think critically and clearly about the actions that they need to take. So this is one example of how we can use synthetic media, hopefully for social good, or at least to start a provocative but important discussion.
Well, let's just quickly define what a deep fake is. It's a piece of synthetic media in which a person in an existing image or video is replaced with someone else's likeness. So the act of trying to fake this kind of content is not necessarily new. You know, it has been possible with even consumer applications like Photoshop, and it is increasingly possible with, you know, social media platforms. But I suppose the difference now is that, you know, true deepfakes, they use powerful techniques from machine learning and AI to manipulate content that, from your point of view, you say it has a high potential to deceive. And so that's kind of the worry about where this kind of dystopian angle of you know, deepfakes, where that might go. So, for example, in the same way that you're talking about using deepfake content with Trump or different presidents talking about climate change, if someone was to create a deepfake of a world leader talking about something and use that as an attempt to manipulate an election or cause some kind of political unrest, it becomes hard to trust any kind of video content, right?
Yeah, and I think the key word is trust. If I look at Western democracies and societies, generally the idea of trust is an ephemeral concept until Bitcoin white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto that really programmatically created that interface of trustlessness, right? How people need to be kept out of the equation sometimes so that you can create that paradigm. Now, with media or with our senses tend to deceive us on a day-to-day basis anyway. If you think about it, we tend to edit conversations in real time. Sometimes we can't even listen to each other. We are operating as a very fallible species when we think about our five senses. If we look at the way the media landscape has evolved and how humans have adapted to these new tools, the newspaper in the early 1900s to the advent of radio. Are you familiar with War of the Worlds, Andy?
Yes.
Somebody did this program on radio, decided to make a real show that aliens had landed, you know, on Earth's surface. And the ensuing result was public panic and disorder in terms of the people who were listening to that show, right? They went out to the streets. They were really concerned because this new medium was emerging. People were so used to the idea that they could trust what they hear. Nobody was expecting that medium to disrupt their sense-making capacity. So we're entering a stage now where technological tools have advanced, but our sense-making capacities are still pretty dumb. They haven't caught on yet. And so we're at this stage where there is a window of opportunity. But the problem is, if I go back to the core narrative of what trust is, the word that you use, trust, the problem is that we now live in a society, in a Western model, where we do not trust the institutions that are printing our money supply. We do not trust the institutions that are giving us the news. And we do not trust sometimes even the people, our fellow neighbors or citizens, to be educated enough to understand and have a shared reality. That is where a bad actor can come in and use this technology for bad and really cause a lot of harm. So I'm concerned about certainly the negative use cases, but as a technologist and as someone who has studied the evolution of the media landscape, I think the potency of this tool is something that we really should embrace and try to grapple with and understand, because it will create new forms of artistic expression that we today in our fallible human minds cannot even imagine.
I love the example that you used initially, the radio performance of The War of the Worlds by Orson Welles.
Yes, that's the guy, yeah.
This was broadcast a long time ago, so you'd need to cast your imagination back to 1938. And, I mean, you can imagine what that would be like if family would be sitting in their lounge deep in rural America or wherever, listening to this intense radio broadcast of Martians coming from outer space to attack the world. And you can imagine what a vivid, powerful and scary experience that would have been. Here we are a couple of generations on, and as you say, effectively the ability to create these fictional narratives of whatever you want is really in the power of the individual. But I just want to understand how easy it is for someone to actually create a really realistic deep fake. For example, you and your team, I believe, you created a deep fake using CZ, who of course is the CEO and one of the founders of Binance, and you put him in, I think, a martial arts scene from a martial arts movie starring Jet Li, and you replaced Jet Li with CZ, and then you created this quite amusing crypto narrative around it. And I know that CZ himself has retweeted that piece of deepfake video content. I think he was quite amused by it, but he also commented that it was quite scary how fast the technology is evolving. His comment was, what ramifications does this have for KYC? Who created that CZ deepfake, and how easy is it for anyone to do exactly the same thing?
The deepfake was created by the team, the AI team that we have of talented AI engineers. And today, to create what you see in that image is essentially what is known as a face swap. So the software program that is available open source is called Deepfakes Labs. And you can actually go and experiment and try some of the code. The only problem is, like we say, Bitcoin's code is open source. Try and create a fork of it. Not everyone's going to be able to, right? So it's technically quite challenging and difficult. You have to be able to navigate arcane GitHub repos and find your way around that meandering maze. But there are good AI engineers who understand how to do a basic face swap. And that's a technology that can be applied quite easily over 3 to 5 days of training the AI algorithm. So I'll just give you a simple framework for the listeners to understand. It's basically you need a good data set. Think of it as good input data. This means you need a person's face to be in several different angles. You want the machine to learn how that person's face, let's say this person's face is CZ's face, how that person's face is in different shadows, in different contexts, in different settings. And then you want to apply that same context and swap that onto someone else. So you want to feed the machine, the AI algorithm, some good data. And the responsibility of finding that data often can be really tricky. So you have to find good data, and then you feed that into the algorithm, the machine, and then it churns out that same face onto a destination that you would want that face to be mapped to. So it starts to learn as it's starting to code, and all of the iterations that it is going through, it then creates that face swap. CZ was kind enough to retweet it and helped us gain attention at the Binance Labs hackathon, which we won. It was also really critical for us to speak and understand, contextualize this within the framework of satire, but also, it's a martial arts flick, so it has to be benign and harmless as a piece of content. Although Tesla's shares have risen, if you speak to some Tesla short sellers, they'll be more than happy to tell you, we'd like to find a way to do a Elon Musk deepfake or something like that where a public figure says horrible things about companies. Plus, we made CZ look cool, right? So him doing 3-fingered push-ups in the traditional martial arts of, was it wushu, is quite novel. So that gives him an aspirational goal to look up to.
Yes, you certainly achieved one goal there of making CZ look cool. You know, anytime you're appearing in a black and white martial arts flick, you're going to look cool. Just ask Quentin Tarantino about that. But also, you know, Elon Musk, you're exactly right in that, you know, short sellers would certainly jump at the opportunity to try and make Elon look bad. They do that every day on Twitter. And Elon is actually, he's gone on the record a couple of times speaking to this issue. In fact, he has complained about not so much the issue of deep fakes, but of people essentially trying to impersonate him on Twitter, which, you know, deepfake is just the end goal of that process. Given what happened with the 2016 election, the American election, and then the subsequent narrative around this idea of fake news, I think to their credit, most of the big social media platforms, they are aware of deepfakes, and, you know, particularly I think Reddit were one of the first to ban a whole lot of deepfake-based subreddits when, you know, there was this surge in porn-based deepfakes a couple of years ago, and so they've banned a lot of those subreddits. YouTube have put a ban on, I think they say, what are technically manipulated videos of public political figures. You know, they were one of the first major platforms to remove that doctored video of Nancy Pelosi. That wasn't a deep fake, but, you know, kind of the same thing. Facebook as well have done this. I think they have put in some guidelines around deepfake videos. Not sure if Twitter have. You know, Twitter in some ways are, you know, most lenient to content that is either satirical or pornographic or politically charged, whether that's for good or bad.
The most lenient player in the space in the United States, at least, is going to be Facebook, because what they've done is that they've banned categorically largely all deepfakes, with the exception of satirical deepfakes, which puts Facebook in sort of this very interesting position where they now have to oddly and satirically define what satire is, which is really an American institution. Whether it was making fun of the British king back in the days of the Boston Tea Parties, or whether it is now when you have impersonators and artists making fun of Trump. It's something so core to the American identity, where you can speak truth to power, or you can speak truth in a humorous way to powerful people. And this is a very powerful tradition that Facebook is sort of trying to shape or define. It'll be interesting to see the landscape evolve there. What Twitter has done is also quite interesting, because they've categorically banned it. They've said that this is content that they find harmful. So it's going to be very tricky for deepfake creators to do malicious harm. The problem, however, is that fake news is something that social media platforms are finding extremely difficult to define, track, and programmatically reduce the influence of. And so we've seen more sophisticated attempts in the past year. For example, with artificial intelligence, you can now generate human-like faces that look really, really human, and you can create Facebook profiles of these faces. So these are called synthetic identities, completely made up. They don't exist at all. They just happen to look so human. The social media platforms have their work cut out for them as to how some of these state or non-state actors may find compelling ways to disrupt a democratic election. And the word democratic is really important, and it goes back to the idea of trust that you talked about. See, if we don't trust news sources anymore, if you don't trust New York Times, if you don't trust Wall Street Journal, if you don't trust these news sources that you think quality journalism is coming from, then we will have a very interesting conversation on, do you trust user-generated grassroots content? Do you trust content that comes from next level of abstraction in terms of power, let's say the council, or then do you trust the next level of abstraction, which is the state?
Yes, that's a very good point, Arif. I think we're in this interesting transition phase where, you know, the average person has access to more information than they ever have before, but it has become increasingly difficult to interpret and trust that information, right? And I would argue that some individuals have perhaps intentionally eroded that trust in institutions and the media?
People now feel that they cannot trust any information that comes out of Washington, D.C. from its different state arms, from its different media outlets. I'll give you a quick example. This morning, I read a fascinating piece from Ray Dalio. He took a direct confrontational approach and attack to the Wall Street Journal about their quality of reporting on his firm and the way that the Wall Street Journal portrayed his firm. Well, it's up for debate as to what exactly is going on. He made a statement about the quality of the media landscape and the amount of trust we are putting into the media. Now, I think that's a philosophical conversation occurring in America, and I think in other parts of the world as well, globally, because that idea of who you trust to give you information is almost a very similar analogy to who do you trust to print money, or who do you trust with your crypto. These are this fundamental thing of defaulting to the individual. That means I, as an individual, must become somebody who can make better sense and meaning of the data around me. So you're seeing a lot of people becoming a little bit more expertise oriented, where they're trying to decipher information on their own. And so I think within this vacuum, what you'll find is somebody who speaks honestly, and even crassly, and even in very rude ways, as long as they are communicating daily in an authentic way, they're likely to be trusted as a resource and sounding board more than these news outlets that might find editorial agendas to fit into. So that's why President Trump today has about 60 million, I think 70 million now, followers on Twitter. And the amount of engagement he's able to get from a communication standpoint is really phenomenal, because people are engaging with that content and grappling with his ability to micro-communicate and interact with his people directly. So it's a very revolutionary form of communication that Twitter has enabled. Also because Jack has presciently, I think, tried to look at a decentralized protocol so that Twitter can find a solution in many ways to some of the problems that come from centralization. So that's how I see the social media landscape evolving.
Yes, great points again, Arif. And it has been interesting to see the social media platforms try and strengthen their processes as the 2020 US election approaches. Just to finish off the deepfake part of this conversation, do you see deepfakes as an informational weapon or threat to the electoral process? Or is it more the harder to define nebulous idea of message manipulation and nefarious ad targeting, or whatever the next iteration is of the Cambridge Analytica model?
When we come to this election cycle, I think the threat of deepfakes, if you ask me, Andy, it's overhyped. Sure, there will be some deepfakes that come out, but the real threats are going to come from editorial agendas that are going to be bought by large, sophisticated political machinery that will prevent people from speaking the truth, or prevent politicians who are honest, authentic, to come forward and actually give them a platform. So you've seen now, for example, people like Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang have a very high level of trustability about them that differs from other establishment candidates. It's an interesting phenomena to observe. But if you juxtapose that and contextualize that against Mike Bloomberg, let's say, entering the race today, or participating in the Democratic debates and buying his way in, you'll see very quickly that the people-powered movements are really rebelling against institutional capital and the amount of influence money can buy. So this is a conversation and dialogue that's going to occur. Now, within this context, if somebody from the landscape of the citizenry decides to use synthetic media tools or deepfake tools to speak the truth, or to use deepfakes as a medium to speak truth to power, or have Mike Bloomberg apologize for buying his spot on the Democratic debate despite not caucusing in Iowa, you'd find very quickly that synthetic media tools will just become like art or political satire, in that the more people are exposed to it, the more creative and innovative they can be. So at the end of the day, if you look at Saturday Night Live and the way that they impersonate, or the way that they bring all of these comedic effects together, you'll get a quick sense of how creative people might be able to be. That's how I see the evolution of the tools functioning within the social media platforms and deepfake specific, how it can enable actually people-powered activism if used within a good context.
Fascinating indeed, Arif. Well, let's go to a very quick break, and then when we come back, I just want to talk briefly on digital influencers, which is something that is starting to happen, especially on Instagram. And then I'd love you to just explain a little bit more about this idea of how to monetize your own personal digital or synthetic identity. We'll do that after the break.
Hey there, you Crypto Conversation fans. My name is Brian Krogsgaard, and in combination with Josh Olszewicz, we record LedgerCast, a weekly podcast all about cryptocurrency trading. It's a little different than what Andy's got going on here with the Crypto Conversation podcast, where he's interviewing folks, and we think that you would enjoy it if you like this. It's also brought to you in partnership with Brave New Coin, and I hope to see you soon. Just go to ledgerstatus.com to check it out, or search for it on your favorite podcast player.
Arif, I want to talk about these synthetic identities from the perspective of the rise of the digital influencer. You know, on Instagram, suddenly there are these synthetic identities, and I think this is going to be a trend that will only increase exponentially in the years to come. There's a lot of different advantages or positives or interesting ideas around digital influencers. Just as one advantage, I suppose, is Tim Ferriss, who is a fairly well-known podcaster, and he put out a blog post in which he talked about his journey from being an average guy to being one of the more famous podcasters and entrepreneurs on the planet by the age of 30, and the sort of the advantages and disadvantages that come with that. And he's talked about in the years to come, this may be true for Bitcoiners as well. If Bitcoin does what we all hope it will, you know, it will be a disadvantage to be famous or have your real world identity tied to your digital identity. That's one use case for digital influencers or digital identities. From your perspective, what does the path to monetizing your own synthetic identity look like?
I think it's a fascinating field that is evolving, fundamentally also tied to some of the evolutions in the AI algorithms that are coming, but also in the ability to create new personalities and avatars and virtual characters. Now, there's a broad swath of, a rather broad category of influencers that you can think of. And I think for me, if I go to the core of it, the biggest synthetic identity that has not yet been discovered, right, is Satoshi Nakamoto. And if you think about it, the pseudonymity that protected him or her or them has allowed this movement to emerge without putting it at risk, right? So it is one of the most decentralized global systems that has been created because the founder was not known, and that pseudonymity protected Satoshi and the people or persons behind them. So let's take that as the starting point. The importance of anonymity, the importance of the ability to abstract away your existing identity so that you are not at risk for what you're saying. Set aside and focus on the power of anonymity, or even just creating a digital copy of yourself or creating digital skins or representations of yourself that may not necessarily be tied to you, but are representative of your actions. So we see this in games and in virtual reality where people participate. I think the earliest broader scale experiments were occurring in Sims and in Second Life, and where people could take on these personas completely and be enmeshed in them, almost identify with them and be digitally embodied, right? But today we are at a stage where you will be able to create a digital copy or a digital likeness of yourself. Very, very soon, I think in about a year or two, you'll see companies that allow you to create realistic 2D or 3D type images of yourself that can say and do things that you'd like them to do. So, and programmatically as well.
But Arif, no one wants to be themselves online. The whole point of having a digital identity is being able to present your imagined best self, right? So that's why, the Fortnite puts out a new skin every week or probably more. And one of the powerful things that they've done is they've created this crossover universe, right? So Fortnite is the center, but they bring in Star Wars skins or a Batman skin or whatever it is, and you have to buy it with V-Bucks, which is the Fortnite currency. I can see a world where it's Ready Player One, really, but very soon you'll be able to adopt one of these identities and just move from the Fortnite universe to Facebook or Instagram, Snapchat, whatever. You'll be able to adopt these skins, essentially. These just virtual identities and move around the digital environment at will.
Yeah, that's certainly coming. And I think the Fortnite universe has proven that model as being extremely novel, because the fact that, it's just like clothes. I mean, in real life, you take that analogy. I mean, there are some people who wear the same clothes all the time, but there are others who find that is a medium of artistic expression. So I see synthetic tools like this actually moving us forward, allowing us to interact with each other, allowing us to build empathy machines where you can actually discover what it's like to be this other person in this reality or in this virtual reality. There's a whole economy that will get created from just a perspective of human creativity and flourishing and their ability to create the skins and games. But at the core of it, the problem, where does the real identity start and where does the synthetic identity begin? There is a virtual influencer by the name of Lil Miquela, I think done by a company in Los Angeles. And Lil Miquela is a fascinating social experiment, but then at the same time, a brand building and storytelling experiment, because people have fallen in love with this fake celebrity. They've fallen in love with this social media star that happens to have a boyfriend, that sings and writes and composes music, and at the same time has a whole social media Instagram feed. Now, here's the rub. The thing about Lil Miquela is that she is extremely programmable, right? And you don't necessarily need to have a human in the equation. This is fundamentally a company that has built an influencer that is now socially engineered to reinforce existing stereotypes or find ways to fit into the existing models of the world. And then on top of that, Lil Miquela is doing brand sponsorships and amazing narratives of her involvement in many different capacities and capabilities that fall within this. It'll be wonderfully interesting and fascinating, I think, if you can get Lil Miquela to accept Bitcoin, because then you'll really expose millions of people to understanding what is happening with our money supply and why it's important to be part of that conversation. The challenge here is that, yes, skins, creativity, Fortnite, all of these are going to be amazing tools, but they're going to be so immersive and powerfully addictive that we as human beings may completely disconnect from physical reality. And Ready Player One is a great sort of dystopian/utopian example of a corporation, capitalist corporation, controlling that entire virtual world, because you can now shape human behavior at massive scale if you have so much of a monopoly on their attention. The core thing that we must come back down to is how do you then preserve an individual's right to choose which worlds they want to participate in? And I think one of the core worlds that we should try to optimize for today is the world we all live in and inhabit that is far more real than virtual reality. And that is the world of the physical. And in this physical world, we have to negotiate, trade, dialogue with each other. If you look at Lil Miquela's celebrity status, the biggest threat she poses presently is to a bunch of actors and actresses and actors who will potentially lose jobs to synthetic celebrities. If you really think about creating programmable interfaces that can now be controlled and emotive and expression and full of expression in life, you are looking at an entire industry that is going to be automated away. It's not going to happen overnight or soon, but it'll be gradually and then suddenly.
No, I think you're exactly right with that point, Arif. There's another company, it's actually a New Zealand company based here in Auckland, and they are called Soul Machines, and they have created some, I suppose you'd call them virtual influencers as well, and they are creating these synthetic identities, and they are for customer experience roles, right? So if it's a help desk or some kind of information job, anything like that. And so you can see that those kind of synthetic identities, they will replace jobs in the service industry, in banking, retail. This is what Andrew Yang talks about, right? And another trend that could accelerate this process is we don't really know what's going to happen with the coronavirus or the next potential pandemic. But if it becomes just a little bit harder and riskier to travel or interact with your fellow humans in the physical environment, that is just going to accelerate the trend towards VR or remote work or televisual work. And again, synthetic identities just are a big part of that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think those are very salient points. The only caveat I'd add, and I love Soul Machines and I love what they're doing from the animation. The artificial intelligence, the ability to generate these dialogues and create human-like dialogues is something that still requires quite a bit of innovation on. The replacements aren't going to happen so soon, but the concern right now that I have with the present model and system, and this is why Alethea and the vision of Alethea is to really decentralize voice and face data. So that means give power back to the individual to be able to create digital copies of themselves, and if they so choose, to monetize it within an open framework. So that means you're not bounded by the universe of, let's say, corporation X or corporation Y, but you can have that transferability and you also have that level of authenticity, because we're going into a world where somebody could take a deepfake of your voice saying something that you never have said. And the problem with that is that you will need a layer of trust. The analogy that I give people is that it has to be sort of similar to Twitter's blue tick, where you know that you're dealing with the real Elon. Anything that is not within that framework is likely to be fake. The problem that trade-off creates, and this is something we need to negotiate, is that it removes anonymity from you. So it's almost as if you have to timestamp and verify the content all the time, and it puts people in a very difficult position. So we're entering an age where we need open, decentralized solutions where your voice data and your face data belongs to you. It doesn't belong to a corporation, doesn't belong to someone who can take that data and make significant IP assets and value from it. You should be able to abstract your face and voice data into a digital substrate, and you should be able to monetize that substrate, whether you create a creative skin or whether you create a digital clone or copy of yourself. So a simple example is we're working with a family right now that wants to preserve their grandfather's voice, and they want to preserve that voice model so that great grandkids who are not yet born can one day hear their grandfather read an audiobook that has not yet been written, right? So you want to be able to create this level of connection, just like we have for our DNA, where we pass that down. Our generation will be able to pass down our voice and face data. Now, in that passing down of that voice and face data, do we want a corporation to be the intermediary in that equation? Or do we want to be able to have some sort of control mechanism that allows us to state the framework that we would like our digital likeness or digital copy to be able to do?
Yes, indeed, Arif. Well, all we know for certain is that there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of different trends, and everything is slowly but quickly starting to collide. So who knows how this will play out, but it's going to be a ride. Let's go to another quick break, and then we'll come back, and then we'll finish off with the very famous Crypto Conversation Hot Take Round.
Whether you're an enterprise fund manager or a retail trader, buying and selling cryptocurrencies successfully requires price discovery you can rely on. Brave New Coin's liquid indices provide trusted US dollar prices for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Ripple. Featuring end-of-day or intraday outputs, you can count on the VLX, ELX, and XRPLX for accurate US dollar pricing for smart contract oracles, settlement price discovery, net asset valuation, and performance analysis. Visit bravenewcoin.com to find out more.
All right, and we're back, and I'm with Arif Khan from Alethea AI. Arif, I like to finish each podcast with a rapid-fire round of crypto hot takes. Are you up for it?
Yeah, I am.
All right, I want your hot takes, your hot fire. Take your best shot. Here we go. Arif, where do you sit on the Bitcoin maximalist to multi-coin opportunist spectrum?
Oh boy. I think in the middle, squarely in the middle.
All right, fair enough. Arif, what would you say is your firmest conviction crypto opinion?
I strongly believe that the conversation on understanding sound money is going to be a defining feature for the next 10 to 15 years when people talk about how we create sound money. That's an important one.
Arif, who do you think wins the American presidential election later this year, 2020?
This is depressing, but I think the incumbent is likely to win.
Okay, a lot of people think that. We'll just have to see. But Arif, UBI, Universal Basic Income, as proposed by Andrew Yang, do you think this is a good idea, just as a potential fix for AI-induced automation?
I think it's a great start, and you need to optimize for individuals that may not necessarily have the capability to decide what to do with that money. And that needs to be factored into the equation. Right now, there are no checks. And that's why sometimes governments have intervened directly with food stamps to provide that. You just want to create systems that allow people to be nudged, at least, to use that money for their highest good.
Yes, indeed. Well, Arif, Bill Gates famously said we tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in 2 years and underestimate what we can accomplish in 10. What do you think the blockchain space looks like in 10 years' time?
Yeah, I think blockchain and synthetic identities will mix, and you and I will be having interviews, or at least of synthetic identities, hopefully be able to have a real conversation that might sound so real, but it may not even be completely real. So we'll create all of these fictional worlds anchored on chain that might be fascinating to explore.
Similarly, and this relates to a lot of what we've said today, but William Gibson said the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. What's an example of the future being here right now, but most people just aren't really aware of it?
Yeah, I've seen some really weird experiments in Silicon Valley, a group called Consciousness Hackers, and I suggest people check them out, but I think they're doing some really interesting things with brainwaves. Some of these ideas are far out today, but I think may become quite interesting and relevant when the time comes.
Fascinating. Well, let's zoom out, Arif. What do you see as the long-term future for the human race? Do you see dystopia or utopia?
I see stasis. I see the same situation today, and I see us grappling with our conflicting biology, conflicting situation. So if you consider dystopia to be alive today, then you'd see dystopia. If you think this is a utopian existence where we have so many freedoms, of course, you have the privilege of living in a certain society. So I think it's still going to stay the same. The more things change, the more stay the same. That's the quote.
Yes, all right. Well, finally, Arif, what is your favorite science fiction book, film, show, or universe?
Yeah, I really love The Arrival. That's a powerful movie. I think it's not a few years old, but really talks to the power of having language as the most transformative technology that human beings have. And that language is the gateway towards conversation with other species. So language is what we use to build our own mental models. Language is the pathway to enlightenment. And I think language is one of our greatest inventions. So code, like Bitcoin, is language that has abstracted itself into programs. Right? So for me, that is a very powerful movie that talks about the importance of language and philosophically very sound.
I love that, Arifa, and I think you're exactly right. And, that is obviously one of the key themes of Sapiens, is humankind's ability to construct stories and shared narratives through language is really what separates us from, anyone else. That's what gives us our intelligence.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, Arif. Let's finish this off. The microphone is yours. Tell the people where they can find you on your various platforms and where they can go to learn more about Alethea AI.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. This was really, really fun. It's www.alethea, ALETHEA.ai. Alethea is the Greek goddess's name for truth, if I recall my philosophy classes in the early days. And the reason why we've named it so is because we think that the truth is under attack, and we have an opportunity now to leverage some of the tools to create a layer of trust around all of this synthetic media that's emerging. So I invite your community of listeners to join us at Alethea AI and to also find us on Telegram, the Alethea AI. You can follow us on Twitter, social, and you can drop me an email at arif@alethea.ai if you are interested in the synthetic media revolution or want to participate in it. We are hiring folks as well, and we don't yet have a presence in New Zealand, but we're growing in Singapore. So more than happy to explore all of the wonderful opportunities that come out from this conversation.
Excellent. Hey, thank you so much, Arif.
Thanks so much, Andy. I really enjoyed this.
Okay, well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that chat with Arif Khan from Alethea AI. Links in the show notes to Alethea, their website, and you can see the CZ from Binance, the deepfake, where CZ starring in a Jet Li martial arts movie. That's worth a watch. You can see that on their website. Also, interesting that Arif picked Arrival. That was the Amy Adams movie where she plays a linguistics expert that must interpret the language of aliens. That was a good movie. And of course, I mentioned Sapiens, the book by Yuval Noah Harari. Such a good book. Sapiens is probably my favorite book of the last 5 years. And, it was a popular book. It is a popular book, almost a cliche to say so. But man, such a good book. It really is an exceptional summary of the history of humanity, the history of civilization, and why we are what we are. And also earlier in the show, we mentioned A War of the Worlds and that infamous 1938 broadcast by Orson Welles. So that broadcast is now in the public domain. It's on YouTube, so a link in the show notes to that as well. And look, if you've got a couple of minutes, I'm just going to rock out a couple of minutes of the intro here, just so you can get a little taste for the vibe, for the flavor. Here it is.
Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space. Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects, vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. In the 39th year of the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. Near the end of October, business was better. The war scare was over. More men were back at work. Sales were picking up. On this particular evening, October 30th, the Crosley service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radio.
Okay, so that was just a little snippet from the beginning of the 1938 broadcast of War of the Worlds. The narrator was Orson Welles. If you enjoyed that, you can listen to the whole thing on YouTube. As always, if you did enjoy the show, please do make sure you subscribe to the Crypto Conversation in whatever podcast app you are using. If you really enjoyed the Crypto Conversation, please do give us a review or a 5-star rating in Apple iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. We are out of here. This was the Crypto Conversation for Brave New Coin.